It's now time, now that we've had a change of pace, to introduce our keynote speaker for this luncheon. You know, when the Hauenstein Center staff and I, when we were talking about how to set up this conference, which, by the way, I think is going swimmingly. I'm so proud of all of the presenters so far, and yes, a lot of insight, so many interesting things that are being shared with us today. And the one thing that I said to staff, I said, you know, we need to have somebody who was inside the White House. We can't just, you know, either throw stones or praise it just from the outside. We need somebody who can give us a flavor for what it was like to be inside. And so that's why we asked Kasey Pipes to come back. Now, Kasey Pipes had come here before us last year, and he talked about an outstanding book of his, Ike's Final Battle, The Road to Little Rock, and the Challenge of Equality. And that book became an Amazon.com bestseller, and the Wall Street Journal praised it as a highly readable, incredible account of Eisenhower's struggle with race and civil rights. And Ralph Hauenstein, of course, who knew something about Eisenhower, was very pleased to hear that presentation. Well, Kasey has done many distinguished things. He's been in politics as a communications and policy advisor for a number of years. And in 2006, he served as chief campaign speechwriter to California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger. Are you the one who invented the term "hasta la vista, baby"? Prior to that, he served President George W. Bush for 5 years. In 1999, he began writing speeches for the Bush for President campaign, and from 2001 to 2003, he wrote speeches in the Bush White House, and in 2004, he was chief author of the National Republican Party platform. So you have quite the insider with us. I also have to say, on a personal note, Kasey's a fellow Texan, so he and I like to have a Shiner Bock together, a good Texas beer together. Another Texan here? No, that's good. 3 of us. Well, 3 of us. All right, the 3 of us for a Shiner Bock. And he did something very unusual. He and his wife, Lacey, their first son they named Lincoln. Well, how great is that? Because we're going to have a Lincoln bicentennial celebration as well, so maybe we'll just have to have you back then too. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Kasey Pipes.
Well, thank you all very much. Thank you, Gleaves, for that introduction. It's great to be back in Grand Rapids. The last time I was here, there was a blizzard, so it's nice to actually see the town. It's a very lovely town, and in fact, I have to tell you, I was telling Gleaves last night, since I was last here, I've done some work with Bill Seidman. So in the process of that work, I've gotten to know a lot more, not only about him and certainly his career with President Ford, but a lot more about this university and a lot more about this town. And to hear Bill Seidman talk is to hear someone who has a real love affair with Grand Rapids, and now, this being my second time back, I think I can see why. So thanks for having me back. I want to thank the entire staff, particularly Gleaves and Mandy, and also Heather and Brian for setting this up and inviting me and for taking such good care of me. I think I am the only non-academic speaking, so I hope I don't embarrass myself today. I do come from sort of a different place. I come from politics, although I'm pretty much retired from it now and trying to write books. I will tell you a funny story about 2 of the people I worked for in '06 when I was working for Schwarzenegger. The president came out and did an event, and he began his speech by saying that he and the governor of California had 3 things in common. They both had great jobs, they both had great wives, and they both have huge biceps. Schwarzenegger thought that was very funny, by the way. So I do sort of approach this from a little bit of a different angle. When we talk about legacy and when we talk about or lessons, I think in terms of history. I think in terms of how history will regard the last several years, how history will regard this president. I certainly am very aware of many of the complaints that are made and many of the shortcomings that people have seen in this administration, and I certainly understand that and have no intention of trying to argue with that. What I want to do rather is talk about how the process of history will likely play out in the next several years, because I don't believe the last word has been written. In fact, I'm not sure even the first word has been written on what's just transpired in the last few years. We are just beginning the process of debating and discussing and deliberating over this president and over these times. You know, there's a funny story about Churchill being asked how history would regard him, and he said, "It'll regard me very well because I intend to write it." Well, Bush is no exception. I mean, he's announced plans. He's going to write a book as well. It's interesting, though. I think this is somewhat revealing. He's not going to do a memoir, as I understand it from what I've read in the press. He is doing a book on tough decisions. And I think that's revealing in a number of ways, because I think it's reflective of the world that he found himself in. And as you may notice on your program, I mean, the title that I gave this talk today is A Hard Presidency. The challenging times and tough choices of President Bush. You know, Emerson said that there's no history, there's biography. And I think there's been maybe a little too much focus on biography, because biography happens within the context of history. So to look at Bush and to look at his legacy, you have to look at what was going on and what the choices were that were available to him. And I think the argument that you're going to see the president make, and this is just sort of my hypothesis, but I think this is where you're going to see him headed, is that these were very, very difficult times. These were very difficult challenges, and there were simply no easy roads for him to go down. And so what I want to do today is, very briefly, and then we'll take some questions, I want to talk about three things. First, I want to talk about what Bush's legacy looks like today and how it's already changing. And I mentioned earlier, I mean, we're in the very early stages of the writing of the history of this, and there's already been some interesting developments that I want to talk about. Secondly, and this goes to what Gleaves was talking about earlier with some of my experience in the White House. What was it that Bush was trying to do, and why was he trying to do it? I mean, we tend to focus on you know, what happened and when it happened, and perhaps it will provide a little more perspective to see kind of why he was doing what he was doing and how. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, how is it that Bush will likely try to argue his case before the bar of history? And what I want to try to do today is, rather than use the zoom lens that we often use in evaluating presidents by zeroing in on a couple of facts or a couple of episodes, I want to use a wide lens and take a look at the entire landscape of the last 8 years. So let's start with sort of where he is now in terms of history and some of the movement that we already are seeing. First of all, he is in very good company, as was talked about earlier by Professor Burke, whose work I've admired for years on Eisenhower and informed my own work. It is very common for a president to leave office more unpopular than when he came in. And Professor Burke mentioned Eisenhower, a guy that I wrote a book about. It's interesting, when Eisenhower left office, I'm a big Russell Kirk fan, and have enjoyed particularly his Burke book and his Eliot book. But Russell Kirk had a famous joke as Eisenhower was leaving office, responding to critics on the right of Eisenhower, who said that you know, he was a little too cozy in the Cold War with the Soviets. And Russell Kirk famously said, "Ike's not a communist; he's just a golfer." Well, you know, with friends like these, Ike didn't need enemies, and his historical record suffered for many years. But as Professor Burke correctly noted, it was Fred Greenstein who discovered the hidden hand, and who found, as Gary Wills later said, a political genius was Gary Wills' formula. I mean, this is a guy behind the scenes, working very skillfully on very difficult problems, and it turns out he was a much better president and a much more active president than anybody realized at the time. Indeed, my own work on civil rights shows that even on that issue, he deserves much more credit than he's gotten, and I think hopefully he's starting to get some of that credit. So even on a president like Eisenhower, you see cycles of history, you see revision, you see people discover new evidence and have new perspectives and new insights. It'll be a while before we get to that point, but there is going to be a significant amount of Bush scholarship and Bush revision, and I think it will progress from where it is now. Now, where is it now? Well, the pundits and experts tell us that he governed as a partisan, presided over a deteriorating economy, and stumbled in the war on terror. Ironically, these conclusions suffer from the same flaws that the critics say they see in Bush. They're too lazy, they're too simple, and they're too lacking in nuance.